November 1944. A biting wind whipped through the Ardennes forest, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. Inside a hastily established American field hospital, a grim tableau unfolded. Staff Sergeant Frank Miller, his face smudged with fatigue, watched as two German nurses, captured during a skirmish, were brought in. They were slight women, their uniforms tattered, their faces etched with a desperate weariness that transcended allegiance. He'd expected defiance, perhaps even contempt. Instead, what he witnessed was a profound, unsettling awe. One of the nurses, a young woman named Greta, her blonde hair matted, stumbled slightly as she was led past rows of neatly organized medical supplies. Her eyes, wide and disbelieving, fixed on a towering stack of surgical dressings, each package pristine, untouched. Then her gaze drifted to crates overflowing with penicillin, plasma, and an array of instruments that gleamed under the flickering lanterns. It was a sight that shouldn't exist, not in a war that had bled Europe dry, not in the desperate final months when their own field hospitals were stripped bare. Greta whispered something in German to her companion, a question, perhaps, or a statement of utter disbelief. The interpreter, a weary corporal, translated. She said she thought we were starving. Miller merely nodded, a bitter taste in his mouth. They were not starving, far from it. This was the opening act of a revelation, a quiet, devastating inversion of everything these women, and indeed much of the German populace, had been told. Their world was about to be redrawn, not by tanks or bombs, but by the sheer, unyielding weight of American industrial output. The narrative woven by Nazi propaganda had been consistent, pervasive, and ultimately a tragic fiction. It painted the Allies, particularly the Americans, as a decadent, racially impure force, inherently weak and riddled with internal strife. Their soldiers were portrayed as poorly equipped, their supply lines stretched to breaking point, their industrial capacity dwarfed by the disciplined might of the Third Reich. Yet here, in the heart of a war zone, stood irrefutable evidence to the contrary. The abundance was not merely impressive, it was obscene, a display of material wealth that defied the very logic of total war as the Germans understood it. For Greta and her colleague, who had spent years patching wounds with dwindling resources, rationing every gauze pad, and watching men die from infections easily treatable with the drugs piled around them, this was a vision from another planet. This moment, this quiet shock, was a microcosm of a much larger truth that would slowly, painfully dawn on the entire German war machine. It was the truth of an economic reality they had fundamentally misunderstood, a productive power they had catastrophically underestimated. The shock of these nurses wasn't just about medicine. It was about the unraveling of a carefully constructed ideological edifice. The Third Reich, from its earliest days, had predicated its military strategy and its very self-identity on a myth of inherent German superiority, not just in martial prowess, but in industrial efficiency and scientific innovation. Their swift victories in the early war years, Poland, France, the Low Countries, seemed to validate this belief. German tanks, German aircraft, German logistics appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface of these triumphs lay a critical vulnerability, a finite resource base and a production capacity, while formidable, that was ultimately limited. They built impressive machines, yes, but they built them in numbers that could not compete with an adversary whose factories, safe across an ocean, hummed with a relentless, terrifying output. The psychological impact of this disparity was carefully managed by the propaganda ministry. Any hint of Allied strength was downplayed, ridiculed, or dismissed as an illusion. Reports of American industrial might were scoffed at, branded as enemy lies. German citizens were assured that their sacrifice, their discipline, and their technological edge would inevitably prevail against an enemy portrayed as soft, materialistic, and ultimately fragile. This grand deception worked, for a time. It sustained morale through brutal winters and devastating bombing raids. It convinced millions that victory, however costly, was assured. But as the war dragged on, as the Eastern Front devoured men and material, and as the Western Allies pushed closer to the Reich's borders, the cracks began to show. The food became scarcer, the uniforms threadbare, the ammunition crates increasingly empty. The contrast with the American reality, as witnessed by Greta and her companion, was becoming too stark to ignore. The propaganda that had once been a shield now became a cruel irony. Consider the sheer scale of the logistical challenge overcome by the Americans. To sustain an army across an ocean, to supply it with not just weapons and ammunition, but with an abundance of medical supplies, food, and every imaginable comfort, required an industrial base of unprecedented power. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 64,500 tanks, and 17 million rifles and carbines. But beyond the headline-grabbing numbers of tanks and planes lay the seemingly mundane, yet equally vital deluge of everyday necessities. Millions of tons of medical supplies, from basic bandages to complex surgical kits, were shipped across the Atlantic. Tens of thousands of tons of K-rations, C-rations, and fresh provisions ensured that American soldiers, even in the harshest conditions, were better fed than any army in history. For the German army, by comparison, resupply was a constant, agonizing struggle. Field hospitals often lacked basic anesthetics. Operations were performed with re-sterilized, worn-out instruments. Infection rates soared. This wasn't a matter of differing medical philosophies. It was a matter of fundamental material availability. The German soldier often went hungry. His equipment was frequently salvaged or repaired beyond its intended lifespan, and medical care was a desperate gamble. The average caloric intake for a German frontline soldier in late 1944 was often below 2,000 calories a day, a figure that barely sustained basic function in combat conditions. American soldiers, by contrast, frequently received upwards of 4,000 calories. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about stamina, morale, and the fundamental ability to fight. The American war machine, fueled by a seemingly limitless flow of resources, was not just outfighting its enemies. It was outproducing, outsupplying, and ultimately, outsustaining them. The captured nurses, witnessing this cornucopia of bandages, antibiotics, and surgical tools, were glimpsing the true engine of the Allied war effort, an engine far more powerful than any tank division. The shock of the German nurses was not an isolated incident. Throughout the latter stages of the war, as Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe and then into Germany itself, similar scenes played out repeatedly. German prisoners of war, accustomed to the privations of their own military and the scarcity of civilian life, were frequently astonished by the quantity and quality of American rations. Stories abound of German soldiers initially refusing to believe that certain foods, like white bread or fresh meat, were commonplace in American camps, convinced they were being offered special treatment or even poisoned. They had been told that the Americans were a nation of weaklings, unable to withstand hardship. Yet here were these weaklings, not only fighting effectively, but doing so while consuming what seemed to the Germans like an unthinkable luxury. In one recorded instance, a captured Wehrmacht officer, observing American troops eating chocolate and smoking cigarettes, remarked to his interrogator, "You fight a war like this?" With such abundance, it is incomprehensible. This sentiment underscored a profound cultural and economic divide. Germany, a nation that had for generations valued frugality and efficiency, had waged war with a mindset of scarcity. The United States, a nation born of expansive resources and mass production, approached war with a mindset of overwhelming abundance. This wasn't merely a difference in tactics. It was a clash of fundamentally different economic paradigms. The Germans were fighting a war of attrition they could not win, against an enemy whose resources seemed to renew themselves endlessly. The sheer scale of American industrial power meant that even catastrophic losses could be quickly replaced. A tank destroyed on the battlefield was swiftly followed by another, and then another. A division decimated was reformed and re-equipped with astonishing speed. This was the mathematical inevitability of the conflict, a cold, hard fact that no amount of ideological fervor could overcome. The implications of this material superiority extended beyond the battlefield and into the very fabric of society. For the German populace, the war had meant increasing hardship, food rationing, and the constant threat of aerial bombardment. Propaganda had framed these privations as shared sacrifice, a necessary component of the struggle for survival against a barbaric enemy. But when German soldiers and civilians encountered the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, they saw a starkly different reality. They saw trucks and jeeps, not horse-drawn carts. They saw fully equipped, well-fed soldiers, not the gaunt, ragged figures often depicted in their own newsreels. They saw an endless stream of supplies, not the desperate scavenging for resources that had become their daily existence. This visual evidence of Allied abundance began to erode the carefully constructed narratives of their own government. If the enemy was truly starving, truly weak, then where did all this come from? The cognitive dissonance must have been immense. For the captured nurses, their personal experience of wartime medical scarcity directly contradicted the vision of American plenty. It wasn't just a matter of having more, it was a matter of having so much more that the very concept of scarcity, as they understood it, seemed to vanish. Penicillin, a miracle drug that could save countless lives, was a rare, precious commodity in German hospitals, often reserved for only the most critical cases. Here it was stacked high, seemingly without end. The contrast was devastating, a silent testament to the futility of their struggle against such overwhelming material force. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had not merely underestimated Allied industrial capacity, it had actively distorted it. They had portrayed the United States as a nation of factories producing consumer goods, not instruments of war. They argued that a democratic capitalist system was inherently inefficient and incapable of the centralized planning required for a truly effective war effort. This was a profound miscalculation. The American system, far from being inefficient, proved to be incredibly adaptable and dynamic. Factories that once built cars were rapidly converted to produce tanks and planes. Civilian industries retooled to support the war effort with astonishing speed. The vast natural resources of the continent, coupled with an eager and skilled workforce, created an economic engine of unparalleled power. By 1944, the sheer volume of goods flowing from American factories was staggering. The Liberty Ship program, for example, designed to overcome the U-boat threat, saw ships rolling off assembly lines in a matter of weeks, not months. These vessels then carried the torrent of supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific, creating a logistical bridge that defied all previous military assumptions. The German High Command, even as late as 1943, still believed that Allied logistics would eventually collapse under their own weight. They clung to the hope that a prolonged war would exhaust the Western powers, just as it had exhausted them. They failed to grasp that for the Americans, the war was not depleting their resources. It was stimulating an economic boom, driving innovation, and accelerating production to levels previously unimaginable. The German nurses, observing the overflowing medical tents, were witnessing the output of this unstoppable economic force, a force that had been deliberately obscured from their view for years. The experience of the German nurses highlights a critical psychological dimension of total war, the struggle for information and belief. In societies engaged in existential conflict, the control of information becomes as crucial as the control of territory. The Nazi regime understood this implicitly, constructing an elaborate edifice of propaganda designed to maintain morale, demonize the enemy, and justify immense sacrifice. For years, this system had functioned effectively. German citizens, isolated from external news sources and fed a steady diet of carefully curated information, genuinely believed in the narrative of their own strength and the enemy's weakness. The images they saw, the stories they heard, all reinforced this worldview. But propaganda, however pervasive, ultimately collides with reality. The moment of Greta's realization, standing amidst stacks of American medical supplies, was such a collision. It was a tangible, undeniable piece of evidence that directly contradicted years of indoctrination. This wasn't a rumor or an enemy broadcast. It was real, concrete, and deeply unsettling. The effect was corrosive. Once a single, undeniable truth pierced the veil of propaganda, other doubts inevitably followed. If they had been lied to about something as fundamental as enemy resources, what else had been fabricated? This erosion of trust, sparked by seemingly small encounters with Allied abundance, played a significant role in the eventual collapse of German morale. It was a slow, insidious process, but one that gained momentum as the Allied armies advanced, bringing with them not just military force, but also an overwhelming demonstration of their material and logistical might. The image of those abundant supplies, vivid and undeniable, imprinted itself on the minds of those who witnessed it, a powerful, silent counter-narrative to years of carefully constructed lies. The sheer scale of American supply lines, meticulously planned and executed, stretched across continents and oceans. The logistical feats achieved by the U.S. military during World War II are almost incomprehensible. Consider the challenges: transporting millions of men, alongside millions of tons of equipment, food, and every imaginable necessity, from the continental United States to battlefields thousands of miles away. The port of Cherbourg, captured in June 1944, became a funnel through which an unending torrent of supplies flowed. By September, it was handling 20,000 tons of supplies daily. This was not simply a matter of unloading ships. It involved an intricate dance of rail lines, truck convoys, and quartermaster depots, all working in concert to ensure that every soldier, from the front lines to the rear echelons, had what they needed. The infamous Red Ball Express, a vast network of truck routes, ran almost continuously, carrying fuel, ammunition, and rations to the advancing armies. Its drivers, often African-American soldiers, performed a grueling, dangerous task. Yet the flow of goods rarely faltered. German logistics, by contrast, relied heavily on horse-drawn transport by late 1944, a stark visual representation of their dwindling resources and fossil fuel scarcity. The contrast was often humiliating for German prisoners. They would see American vehicles, trucks, jeeps, even specialized equipment like mobile kitchens and dental clinics, operating with an ease and abundance that was utterly alien to their experience. The sight of an American field hospital, with its modern tents, generators, and extensive medical equipment, was particularly jarring. German hospitals, especially near the front, were often makeshift affairs, operating with limited electricity and even more limited supplies. The captured nurses were not just observing a better-equipped adversary. They were observing an entirely different approach to warfare, one predicated on the ability to overcome any logistical hurdle with overwhelming material force. The final devastating irony was that the Third Reich, which had so prided itself on its industrial and organizational prowess, was ultimately defeated not just by superior tactics or courage, but by a tidal wave of material. The image of the American field hospital, overflowing with supplies, was a potent symbol of this truth. It wasn't about tanks alone, or planes alone. It was about everything that supported the fighting man, from the quality of his boots to the effectiveness of the drugs that saved his life. The German war machine, despite its initial successes, was ultimately a brittle structure built on unsustainable foundations. It lacked the depth of resources, the breadth of industrial capacity, and the strategic foresight to compete with an adversary capable of producing and delivering an almost limitless quantity of war material. The nurses, Greta and her companion, were unwitting witnesses to the culmination of this disparity. Their initial shock, their quiet disbelief, encapsulated the larger awakening that was spreading across Germany as the war drew to its inevitable conclusion. The propaganda had promised victory through sacrifice and will. Reality delivered defeat through an overwhelming, unstoppable avalanche of steel, rubber, and penicillin. The truth, in the end, was not communicated through speeches or radio broadcasts, but through the silent, eloquent testimony of abundance itself. The stacks of bandages, the crates of medicine, the endless flow of supplies. These were the true architects of their defeat, revealing the hollow core of a regime built on a foundation of lies and a profound misjudgment of its enemies' true strength. This quiet revelation in a cold forest in November 1944 was the beginning of the end, a stark, undeniable testament to the power of resources over rhetoric and the crushing weight of material superiority that ultimately decided the fate of nations.